Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back in time, way back, to a world of stone and shadow, of whispered secrets and unyielding power. Imagine, if you will, the biting wind whipping around crenellated towers, the distant clatter of hooves unpacked, earth and the low hum of 100 lives echoing within massive, unyielding walls. You're standing at the edge of a world both grand and incredibly grim. A world where what you thought you knew about chivalry and courtly love might just crumble like old mortar. We're going to peel back the layers of romanticized history and gaze into the true, often grimy, heart of the medieval castle. And trust me, you probably wouldn't survive a single week in one of these places without a very sturdy stomach and a complete disregard for personal hygiene. You can almost feel the chill seeping from the ancient stones, can't you? The air, thick with the scent of wood smoke, damp earth, and something less pleasant. You glance up at the towering gatehouse, its massive timbers groaning softly in the breeze, and for a moment you feel a prickle of unease. This isn't the fairy tale you grew up with. This is the real deal, where life was harsh, brutal, and often surprisingly short. These weren't just grand homes, they were fortresses, prisons, and sometimes the final resting place for those who crossed the wrong Lord. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, if you're listening, let me know where you are in the world and what time it is. It's always wild to think about us all connecting across different time zones, sharing this sleepy journey into the past. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand at the edge of a deep, murky moat, the water still and reflecting the bruised twilight sky. Above you, the drawbridge, a colossal timber beast, groans softly, hinting at the immense weight it has borne for centuries. You imagine it being hauled up at the first sign of trouble, a thunderous crash as it locked into place, sealing the inhabitants inside, for better or worse. You squint, trying to discern details in the fading light, but the castle simply looms. A dark silhouette against the last vestiges of daylight, its secrets held tight within its ancient stones. What you don't immediately see, however, is the sheer, unadulterated human misery that often went into raising such a magnificent structure. These towering symbols of power weren't simply conjured from the earth. They were literally wrenched from it through backbreaking, life-shortening labor. Historians still argue whether the common folk truly understood the scale of the undertaking when a new castle began to rise. What's clear is that the Lord's decree was law, and if a new stronghold was needed, the manpower would be provided, willing or not. Imagine, if you will, being one of the thousands of peasants pressed into service, forced to abandon your meager fields and families to quarry stone from distant hillsides. You'd trudge for miles, day after grueling day, under the watchful, often cruel eyes of overseers. You might spend weeks hacking at solid rock with rudimentary tools, your hands raw and bleeding, your muscles screaming with every swing of a pickaxe. The stones themselves, some weighing many tons, had to be moved, without the aid of modern machinery. This was done through sheer, brutal force. Gangs of men, and sometimes women and children, hauling on ropes, rolling logs, and using simple levers to coax these monstrous blocks into position. It was a testament to human ingenuity, yes, but also to human suffering. Think about the sheer logistics. Thousands of cubic meters of stone, tons of timber, countless barrels of lime for mortar. All of it had to be sourced, transported, and then meticulously fitted together. There were no safety regulations, no hard hats, just the constant threat of a collapsing scaffold, a dropped stone, or a misstep on slippery mud. Accidents were not just common, they were an expected part of the job. A broken limb meant a life of destitution, if not a swift death from infection. A quirky tidbit you might not consider is the sheer amount of animal power involved. While humans did most of the heavy lifting, teams of oxen and horses, often underfed and overworked, were crucial for hauling the heaviest loads. Their lives were as disposable as the laborers, mere cogs in the relentless machine of castle construction. You can almost hear their pained grunts and the cracking of whips, mingling with the curses of the masons and the rhythmic clang of hammers. It was a cacophony of suffering echoing across the nascent walls, forming the true foundation of these grand structures. The echoes of construction, the groans of oxen, and the shouts of foremen still seem to reverberate as you step further into the castle's unseen realities. You've walked past the impressive, impenetrable outer walls, but now, imagine you're allowed behind the scenes, past the initial spectacle. You might envision skilled masons, precise and artistic, carefully carving intricate details. And while such artisans existed, the grim truth of castle construction involved a far more brutal, less glamorous reality. You see, the quality of life, even for the skilled laborers, was shockingly poor. Housing was often temporary, squalid. Hovels thrown up near the construction site, offering little respite from the elements. Food was meager, usually a gruel or coarse bread, just enough to sustain the arduous physical demands. Disease, fueled by poor sanitation and close quarters, swept through these temporary encampments like wildfire. You watch as workers haul massive timbers, not just for the castle's skeletal structure, but for the elaborate scaffolding that would reach dizzying heights. Imagine clambering up these swaying, temporary structures, hundreds of feet in the air, with no safety nets, no harnesses, just the raw courage and desperate need to feed your family. A misstep, a loose plank, a sudden gust of wind, any of these could mean a terrifying, bone-shattering plunge to the unforgiving ground below. And when a worker fell, the sight simply swallowed them. Another anonymous casualty in the ceaseless drive to erect these monumental structures. It's a sobering thought, isn't it? How many unnamed individuals sacrificed their lives to build what we now admire as historical landmarks. Beyond the brute force, there was an impressive, though often chilling, ingenuity at play. Medieval engineers were masters of leverage and simple machines. They developed incredibly effective treadwheel cranes, where men walked inside giant wheels, like human hamsters, to lift heavy stones high onto the rising walls. You might scoff at the simplicity, but these contraptions, often powered by a dozen or more men, could lift blocks weighing several tons. Historians still argue whether the invention of the geared windlass or the treadwheel crane had a greater impact on the speed and scale of medieval construction. What's clear is that these ingenious devices, while efficient, still demanded immense physical exertion from those operating them, their sweat and strain lubricating the very gears of progress. And let's not forget the mortar. It wasn't just a simple mix. It was a carefully formulated concoction, often using lime derived from burning limestone in massive kilns. Imagine the intense heat, the choking smoke, the constant danger of burns for the laborers tending these fires. It was a hellish task, essential for creating the strong, durable bond that would hold the castle together for centuries. Sometimes, quirky additives were used, though their efficacy is debated. There are tales of animal blood, urine, or even egg whites being mixed into the mortar, believed to improve its strength or give it some mystical protective quality. You probably won't find crocodile dung sunscreen, but the medieval builders certainly had their own strange concoctions. It might sound gross, but in an age of limited scientific understanding, every possible edge, no matter how bizarre, was explored. The sheer volume of material needed meant that entire landscapes were altered. Quarries became vast, gaping wounds in the earth, and forests were decimated to provide the necessary timber for beams, floors, roofs, and scaffolding. The environmental impact, while not a concern at the time, was immense. Villages might be razed to clear a building site, their inhabitants displaced, their lives uprooted, all for the glory and security of a lord who saw them as little more than resources. You can almost hear the echoes of their forced migrations, the silent tears shed for lost homes, absorbed by the very ground upon which the castle would rise. And then there were the specialized crafts. Blacksmiths, their faces grimed with soot, toiled endlessly, hammering out iron tools, nails, hinges, and the countless small metal parts essential for construction. Their forges glowed fiercely, day and night, a constant reminder of the intense heat and danger they faced. Carpenters, with their surprisingly sophisticated tools, shaped enormous timbers with remarkable precision, creating intricate joint work that would hold the massive roof structures together. They worked high above the ground, their lives literally hanging by a thread of their own craftsmanship. It wasn't just brute strength. It was also incredible skill, honed over generations, passed down through families, often with little recognition or reward beyond their daily sustenance. The entire process was a microcosm of medieval society, a rigid hierarchy, immense power wielded by a few, and the back-breaking labor of the many. You might think of castles as purely defensive structures, designed to repel invaders, but they were also profound statements of social control. Their very existence demonstrated the Lord's absolute authority, his ability to command resources and human lives on a scale that is almost unimaginable today. They were monuments built on the sweat, blood, and sometimes the very lives of the common people. So, the next time you see a majestic medieval castle, remember that beneath its grand facade lies a story of immense human effort, often coerced, frequently dangerous, and always demanding. It's a reminder that beauty and power often come at a very steep human cost. Asterisk. You've seen how castles were literally built upon the backs of the struggling masses. But now, let's push through those newly erected gates, past the echoing courtyards, and into the daily lives within these formidable walls. Prepare yourself, because the romantic notions of knights in shining armor and elegant ladies often collide violently with the truly repulsive reality of medieval hygiene. Forget your modern sensibilities. Imagine living in a place where personal cleanliness was, to put it mildly, an afterthought. You might picture grand feasting halls, bustling with servants and filled with the aroma of roasted meats. And while that certainly happened, what you wouldn't smell, or rather, what you would smell, whether you liked it or not, were the pervasive odors of unwashed bodies, stale food, animal waste, and overflowing latrines. Castles, despite their imposing architecture, were often incredibly unsanitary places. Waste management, as a concept, was rudimentary at best. Human and animal waste was often simply dumped into the moat, or, if a moat wasn't available, into cesspits, or even directly from garderobes, essentially glorified stone chutes that emptied directly onto the ground outside the castle walls. A quirky tidbit: these garderobes were sometimes referred to as privies, or lumps of ease, which, if you think about it, is a rather ironic name given the distinct lack of ease associated with their use. And no, they weren't designed as air fresheners. Despite what some popular myths might claim about the draft from below acting as an early form of ventilation, if anything, they likely served as a rather effective means of broadcasting the castle's daily doings to anyone downwind. Bathing was a rarity for most. While nobles might indulge in a bath a few times a year, often with perfumed water and herbs to mask the underlying funk, the common folk and servants bathed far less frequently, if at all. You'd be living in close quarters with people who hadn't properly washed in weeks, possibly months. The concept of germ theory was millennia away, so the link between filth and disease simply wasn't understood. You might, in your modern mind, wrinkle your nose at the thought, but for them it was just life. Your clothes, too, would seldom be washed. Imagine the accumulated grime, sweat, and stains on tunics and gowns worn day in and day out. Laundry was a laborious process, usually involving strong lye and river water, and was certainly not an everyday occurrence. Disease, as you can imagine, was rampant. Without proper sanitation, medical knowledge, or effective treatments, even a common cold could escalate into something far more serious. Outbreaks of dysentery, smallpox, and the dreaded bubonic plague could decimate castle populations. The castle walls, designed to keep enemies out, did nothing to stop the silent, invisible invaders of bacteria and viruses. Historians still argue whether the lack of sanitation or the constant close contact was the primary driver of disease within castles. What's undeniable is that life expectancy was dramatically shorter, and childhood mortality rates were tragically high. You'd likely witness frequent deaths, even among the younger residents. And perhaps you'd become accustomed to the quiet removal of bodies, another harsh reality of medieval existence. Medical practices were, by our standards, often horrifying. Bloodletting, using leeches or lances, was a common treatment for almost any ailment, believed to rebalance the body's humors. You might see someone being bled for a fever, or for indigestion, or even for melancholy. Herbal remedies were widely used, some effective, others pure superstition. Surgeons, if available, often performed amputations without anesthetic, relying on speed and brute force. Imagine the screams, the crude tools, the very real possibility of dying from shock or infection afterward. It makes a trip to the dentist seem like a spa day. And what about pests? Castles, with their stone walls and often damp conditions, were ideal breeding grounds for rats, mice, fleas, and lice. You'd constantly be scratching at unseen bites, perhaps finding small, dark creatures crawling through your hair or clothes. These weren't just annoying. Fleas, in particular, were notorious vectors for diseases like the plague. You'd share your bed, your food, and your living space with countless unwelcome companions. A constant battle against tiny invaders you could never truly win. It's a rather charming thought, isn't it? Sharing your straw mattress with a family of mice and an army of fleas. You'd probably develop a twitch from constant itching. Even the food, while sometimes lavish for the elite, presented its own challenges. Preservation methods were basic: salting, smoking, and drying. Fresh produce was seasonal, and meat could go bad quickly without proper storage. Food poisoning was a constant threat. You might find yourself chewing on tough, over-salted meat, or gnawing on bread that was less than fresh, all while trying to ignore the buzzing flies that had a more recent claim to your meal. The sheer effort required to simply survive, to remain healthy enough to perform your duties, was immense. Life within the castle walls, far from being a romantic idyll, was a constant negotiation with dirt, disease, and discomfort. You've weathered the stench and the tiny, unwelcome roommates of medieval castle life, and now let's ascend the spiral stairs, past the guardrooms and the servants' quarters, to the very heart of power, the Lord's chambers. Here, in what might seem like the most opulent and secure part of the castle, you might expect a life of effortless luxury, but scratch beneath the surface of royal tapestries and polished furniture, and you'll find a world riddled with paranoia, political maneuvering, and surprisingly mundane anxieties. Being a king or a powerful lord in the medieval era was less about absolute comfort and more about absolute vigilance. You might imagine a lord or king draped in ermine, issuing decrees with unquestioned authority. And while their power was indeed immense, it was rarely absolute in practice. Their lives were a constant tightrope walk, balancing the demands of powerful vassals, the threats of rival lords, and the ever-present danger of internal plots. Every meal could be poisoned, every handshake a prelude to betrayal, every seemingly loyal servant a potential spy for an enemy. You would live under the constant shadow of suspicion, trusting few and always sleeping with one eye open, even within the supposed sanctuary of your own castle walls. It makes a modern-day CEO's stress levels look like a leisurely stroll in the park. Consider the concept of succession. For a lord, ensuring a legitimate male heir was paramount. The birth of a son was cause for immense celebration, solidifying the family line and promising stability. But what if there were no sons, or too many, leading to squabbling and potential civil war? Or what if a son was weak, sickly, or simply deemed unfit to rule? These were profound anxieties that gnawed at the ruling class. Historians still argue whether the perceived weakness of an heir or the inherent ambition of neighboring lords was a greater catalyst for medieval conflicts. What's clear is that the future of an entire lineage and the lives of countless subjects hinged on the genetic lottery and the temperament of a single individual. You can almost feel the collective breath held in the birthing chambers, the prayers whispered for a healthy male child. Beyond the grand politics, there were the surprisingly petty concerns that often consumed royal households. Imagine the endless bickering over precedence, the jealousies among courtiers, the snubs and slights that could escalate into serious feuds. Who sat closest to the lord at dinner? Whose children were favored? Which lady received the finest silks? These might seem trivial to you, but in a world where status was everything and slight could be an insult to one's honor, these social dramas were intensely important, often leading to real-world consequences like ostracism, banishment, or, even worse, it was like a medieval reality show, but with much higher stakes and no camera crew. Then there was the sheer boredom. Life in a castle, especially during long winters or peaceful periods, could be incredibly monotonous. There was no internet, no television, no endless streaming services to binge. Entertainment often consisted of hunting, falconry, storytelling, music, or perhaps a visiting jester. But even these diversions could only fill so much time. You might find yourself staring out of a narrow window, watching the rain fall, longing for some excitement, or perhaps just a good book that wasn't religious scripture. It's a quirky tidbit, but many medieval lords and ladies, despite their wealth, actually had very little privacy or personal space. Their chambers were often bustling with servants, courtiers, and petitioners, meaning true solitude was a rare luxury. Imagine never being truly alone, even when trying to simply relax. And what about health? While the nobility might have access to slightly better food and perhaps more attentive, if still primitive, medical care, they were by no means immune to disease. The plague didn't care if you wore a crown. Gout, a painful condition often linked to rich diets, was common among the elite. Fevers, infections, and even dental problems could quickly become life-threatening. You might witness your lord or lady writhing in pain, attended by leeches and herbal concoctions, their royal authority powerless against the ravages of illness. It's a sobering thought that for all their power, they were as vulnerable to the simplest infections as the lowliest. Peasant, finally, consider the burden of leadership. A lord was responsible for the well-being of his lands and his people. He had to dispense justice, maintain order, manage resources, and, when necessary, lead his forces into battle. This wasn't a ceremonial role. It was a demanding, often thankless, job that required constant decision-making under pressure. The weight of these responsibilities, coupled with the ever-present threats to their power and person, meant that even the most powerful individuals in a medieval castle lived lives that were far from idyllic. So, the next time you picture a regal king or a serene queen, remember the unseen anxieties, the constant vigilance, and the very real daily struggles that lurked beneath the gilded surface of medieval royalty. You've had a glimpse into the gilded cage of royal life, a world of power and paranoia. But now, let's descend into the true heart of medieval dread, the castle dungeon. Forget the Hollywood portrayals of vast, echoing caverns filled with sophisticated torture devices. The reality was often far more grim, mundane, and terrifying in its simplicity. These weren't always sprawling, underground complexes, but rather often just a few cramped, lightless chambers designed for maximum despair and minimal fuss. You imagine a winding torchlit staircase leading into the depths. But often, the most feared dungeons were oubliettes, from the French word oubliette, meaning to forget. These were literally pits, dark and airless, accessible only through a small opening in the ceiling. Once you were dropped in, you were meant to be forgotten. No windows, no doors, just solid rock above and around you. The only light you might ever see again would be the fleeting glimpse of a guard's lantern as a meager meal of stale bread and water was lowered down. You'd be plunged into absolute darkness, your senses immediately overwhelmed by the damp chill, the reek of your own waste, and the gnawing loneliness. It's enough to give you a serious case of claustrophobia just thinking about it. Life, or rather, existence, in such a place was a slow, agonizing process of psychological and physical decay. You'd quickly lose track of time, days bleeding into weeks, weeks into months, in an endless, suffocating night. The cold would seep into your bones, never truly leaving. The damp would cling to your clothes, promoting skin infections and a persistent cough. Your muscles would atrophy from disuse, making even standing a painful chore, and the hunger, a constant dull ache, would become your most intimate companion. A quirky tidbit: some oubliettes were so narrow at the bottom that prisoners couldn't even sit down comfortably, forced to stand or crouch in perpetual discomfort. Imagine the agony of that, day after day, while elaborate torture devices like Iron Maidens were rare and largely a later invention or theatrical flourish. Medieval Dungeons certainly utilized methods of torment, often psychological or brutally simple. Shackles, chains, and manacles were common, designed not just to prevent escape, but to inflict constant discomfort, rubbing skin raw and restricting movement. Solitary confinement itself was a profound form of torture, driving many to madness. The mind, left with nothing but its own thoughts in the crushing darkness, could become its own worst enemy, conjuring phantom sounds and visions. Historians still argue whether the primary purpose of medieval dungeons was punishment, interrogation, or simply the secure holding of high-value prisoners. What's clear is that they were designed to break the human spirit, regardless of the ultimate intent. You might hear the drip of water, a maddeningly regular sound in the impenetrable silence. Perhaps the scuttling of rats, emboldened by the darkness, becoming your only companions. Or the distant, muffled sounds of life from above. Music, the clatter of plates, a cruel reminder of the world from which you had been brutally severed. Every sound would be amplified, every echo stretched and distorted by the stone walls, until reality began to blur. Disease was an even greater threat here than in the general castle population. With no sanitation, prisoners were forced to live in their own filth. The air would be heavy with the stench of human waste, vomit, and unwashed bodies. Infections would fester untreated, often leading to gangrene and a slow, painful death. There was no medical care, no one to offer comfort, just the cold, indifferent stone and the gradual descent into illness and despair. You'd be lucky if a sudden fever carried you off quickly. Often, it was a lingering, agonizing decline. The food, when it came, was typically scraps, often spoiled, thrown down with little care. You'd compete with the rats for morsels, your dignity slowly eroding with each passing day. Water might be scarce or contaminated, leading to dehydration and further illness. This wasn't about rehabilitation or even quick execution. It was about degradation, about systematically stripping away every last vestige of a person's humanity, until they were little more than a broken shell. So, the next time you visit a medieval castle and gaze into what is presented as a dungeon, remember that the true horrors were rarely the elaborate mechanisms of torment. They were the cold, the dark, the solitude, the filth, and the gnawing certainty that you had been utterly, completely forgotten by the world above. It was a place designed not for dramatic escape, but for the quiet, agonizing dissolution of hope and spirit. You've lingered long enough in the suffocating darkness of the dungeon. Now, let's emerge, blinking, into the daylight, only to find ourselves amidst a different kind of horror, the siege. Medieval castles, as you know, were built to withstand attack, to be bastions against invading armies. But what you might not fully grasp is the sheer brutality, the prolonged suffering, and the ingenious, yet often horrific, tactics employed. During a full-blown siege, from both the perspective of the attackers and the desperate defenders trapped within those formidable walls, imagine, if you will, the sudden shift in the castle's atmosphere. The familiar sounds of daily life replaced by a chilling silence, followed by the distant rumble of thousands of approaching men, the glint of sun on a forest of spears, and the ominous creak of siege engines being hauled into position. You'd feel the collective breath catch in the castle, a shared understanding that life as you knew it had just been irrevocably altered. This wasn't a quick skirmish. A siege could last for weeks, months, even years, a test of endurance and willpower. As much as military might, for the attackers, the goal was simple: force the castle to surrender. This could be achieved through direct assault, but that was incredibly costly in lives. So, ingenuity came into play. Massive trebuchets and catapults would begin to hurl colossal stones, not just at the walls to breach them, but also over them, raining down destruction within the castle courtyard. You'd hear the terrifying whistle of a stone missile arcing through the air, followed by a thunderous crash as it pulverized a stable, a tower, or, God forbid, a group of people. A quirky tidbit: sometimes attackers would hurl not just stones, but diseased animal carcasses or even the bodies of their own fallen enemies over the walls, attempting to spread sickness and demoralize the defenders. Imagine the horror of seeing a decaying body hurtle over the parapets, a gruesome biological weapon aimed directly at your dwindling morale. But brute force wasn't the only option. Undermining was a common tactic. Attackers would dig tunnels, known as saps, beneath the castle walls, propping up the excavated earth with wooden timbers. Once the tunnel was complete, they'd set the timbers alight, causing the tunnel to collapse and, ideally, the section of wall above it to come crashing down in a cloud of dust and debris, creating a breach. You can almost feel the ground tremble, hear the distant, muffled sounds of picks and shovels beneath your feet, knowing that at any moment the very foundations of your sanctuary could give way. Historians still argue whether the psychological impact of mining or the direct destructive power of siege engines was more effective in compelling castle surrenders. What's clear is that both presented existential threats to those inside. For those trapped inside the castle walls, life during a siege became a desperate struggle for survival. Food and water, meticulously rationed at first, would dwindle. You'd feel the gnawing pangs of hunger, perhaps resort to eating less palatable fare like rats or leather, anything to keep going. Clean water would become a precious commodity, often contaminated or scarce, leading to outbreaks of dysentery and other waterborne diseases. The constant tension would wear down even the stoutest nerves. You'd sleep fitfully, if at all, constantly listening for the sounds of an assault, the crack of a trebuchet, or the ominous thud of a battering ram against the main gate. The defenders, too, had their own grim tactics. Boiling water, hot sand, or even molten lead could be poured from murder holes onto attackers trying to breach the gates. Archers would rain down volleys of arrows, and crossbowmen would pick off targets with deadly precision. You'd stand on the battlements, peering through the crenellations, your heart pounding, as you watched the enemies swarming below, knowing that one well-aimed shot could end your life or that of your neighbor. The air would be thick with the stench of fear, sweat, and impending doom. The psychological warfare was intense. Attackers might parade captured family members of the defenders outside the walls, threatening their lives. They might shout taunts and insults, trying to break the castle's resolve. For the defenders, simply maintaining hope and discipline was a daily battle. You'd look into the eyes of your comrades, seeing the same fear and exhaustion reflected back, but also a stubborn determination to hold out, perhaps until relief forces arrived. And when a castle finally fell, the consequences were dire. Surrender might mean a negotiated peace, but a breached castle often meant a brutal sack. You would face the horror of an enemy army pouring through the gates, looting, pillaging, and slaughtering indiscriminately. No one would be safe, not the soldiers, not the women, not the children. It was a terrifying prospect, the ultimate price of defeat, a stark reminder that the castle, for all its strength, was not an impenetrable shield against the absolute savagery of medieval warfare. So, the next time you see the sturdy walls of a medieval castle, remember the desperate battles fought within and without, The brutal ingenuity of attack and defense, and the sheer human cost of holding out against overwhelming odds. You've witnessed the brutal spectacle of a siege, the desperate struggle for survival against external forces, but now shift your gaze inwards. Even when the drawbridge was up and the gates were barred against outward threats, medieval castles were rarely truly secure, for within their very walls, lurking in the shadows of the great hall, and whispered in the quiet corners of the chapel, was the constant, gnawing threat of spies and treachery. Imagine a world where every smile might hide deceit, every whispered conversation a potential plot, and every seemingly loyal servant an enemy agent. You might think of spies as cloaked figures sneaking through the night, and certainly some clandestine operations happened that way. But often, the most effective spies were the ones already inside. Trusted members of the household, disgruntled servants, ambitious courtiers, or even seemingly innocuous merchants who visited the castle regularly. They weren't looking for secret passages as much as they were listening to unguarded conversations, observing troop movements, noting the stores in the larder, or simply reporting on the general mood and weaknesses of the lord. A casual comment, overheard in the kitchen, could be worth a fortune to a rival lord. You'd always have to be on your guard, carefully choosing your words, even among those you considered friends, because in this world, friendship could be a fragile thing indeed. Consider the motives for betrayal. For some, it was simple greed, a promise of gold or land. For others, it was ambition, a desire to rise in power by siding with a new regime. Perhaps it was revenge for a perceived slight, or a deep-seated grievance against the lord. Or sometimes, it was coercion, where an enemy might threaten a spy's family outside the castle walls, forcing their hand. Historians still argue whether the prevalence of religious fervor or the stark realities of feudal power dynamics were greater drivers of medieval treachery. What's clear is that loyalty was a fluid concept, often swayed by self-interest and survival. You can almost feel the air in the great hall thicken with unspoken suspicions, the subtle glances exchanged, the constant undercurrent of distrust. The methods of gathering information were surprisingly sophisticated for their time. Messages could be hidden in innocuous objects, carried by seemingly harmless travelers, or even encoded in songs or poems. A quirky tidbit: some medieval spies reportedly used tiny holes bored into teeth or hollowed out loaves of bread to conceal secret messages. Imagine trying to explain that to a customs officer today. Disguises were also employed, allowing agents to infiltrate enemy territory, posing as pilgrims, beggars, or traveling minstrels, all the while gathering intelligence. It was a constant game of cat and mouse, played out on a grand scale, with very real consequences. The stakes of discovery were incredibly high. If a spy or traitor was uncovered, the punishment was swift and brutal. Execution was common, often publicly and agonizingly, designed to serve as a deterrent to others. You might witness a hanging from the castle walls, or even a more gruesome dismemberment, a stark reminder of the Lord's absolute authority and the terrible price of disloyalty. The screams would echo through the courtyard, a chilling lesson. For anyone contemplating a betrayal, even trusted messengers could be agents of deceit. A messenger carrying a seemingly innocent letter might have a second, hidden message intended for the enemy. Or they might simply be observing the route, noting weak points in defenses, or gauging the strength of the Lord's retinue. You'd never truly know who you could trust, even those seemingly on your side, because alliances could shift as quickly as the wind. The constant threat of internal subversion meant that lords had to maintain networks of their own informants, eyes and ears throughout the castle and beyond. Servants might be encouraged to report suspicious behavior, guards might be secretly tasked with watching their comrades, and even family members might be under discreet surveillance. It created an atmosphere of pervasive unease, where genuine connection and camaraderie could be undermined by the ever-present possibility of being reported. It's like living in a constant state of low-grade paranoia, where even a misplaced goblet could be interpreted as a sign of something sinister. So, the next time you think of the grand, secure walls of a medieval castle, remember that the greatest threats often came not from outside, but from within. The whispers in the dark, the unguarded moments, the secret ambitions of those closest to power. These were the true dark secrets that perpetually haunted the medieval castle, turning every day into a silent battle of wits and loyalty, a battle that often ended in betrayal and blood. You've delved into the shadowy world of castle intrigue, but now, let's step away from the lords and ladies, the spies and the soldiers, and turn our attention to the vast, often invisible, workforce that kept the castle breathing, the servants. While popular imagination often focuses on the grandeur of the nobility, the reality is that castles were enormous, complex machines, and they required countless hands to function. Imagine a bustling, perpetually busy environment, fueled by the relentless, often thankless labor of dozens, sometimes hundreds, of individuals whose lives were defined by service. You might envision a few maids scurrying about, or a cook stirring a pot, but the sheer diversity of roles within a medieval castle was staggering. There were scullery maids scrubbing pots, laundresses laboring over heavy clothes, stable hands tending to horses, gardeners cultivating plots, and foresters managing the lord's hunting grounds. There were blacksmiths, carpenters, masons, and glazers maintaining the fabric of the castle itself. You'd find brewers, bakers, butlers, chamberlains, and even specialized roles like the gong farmer, whose unenviable job it was to clear the castle's cesspits, a truly pungent occupation. I assure you, it was a hierarchical system, with some servants holding positions of trust and authority, while others were little more than anonymous drudges. The hours were incredibly long, often from dawn until dusk, and sometimes even through the night. There were no weekends, no holidays, just the continuous demands of the castle. Your days would be filled with repetitive, physically demanding tasks. Imagine carrying heavy buckets of water from the well, chopping endless piles of firewood, or grinding grain for hours. You'd be constantly on your feet, your hands calloused, your back aching, driven by the need to simply get through the day. A quirky tidbit: even the seemingly simple task of lighting and maintaining fires throughout the castle was a full-time job for several servants, ensuring warmth and light in dozens of rooms and hearths. It was a constant battle against the cold and the dark. Food for servants was basic and often monotonous, far removed from the lavish feasts enjoyed by the nobility. You'd subsist on coarse bread, perhaps some pottage, a thick stew of vegetables and grains, and very occasionally some scraps of meat. It was enough to survive, but rarely enough to truly satisfy. Living conditions were often cramped and uncomfortable. Servants might sleep in dormitories, on straw mattresses, or even on the floor of the rooms they worked in. Privacy was non-existent, and warmth during the bitter medieval winters would be a constant struggle. You'd huddle with your fellow servants, relying on shared body heat and thin blankets, dreaming of a truly warm bed. Disease, as you know, was a constant companion in medieval times, and servants, often living in less sanitary conditions and in closer proximity to each other, were particularly vulnerable. A common cold could sweep through the servant quarters, incapacitating a significant portion of the workforce. Injuries from their demanding labor were frequent, and without proper medical care, even a simple cut could turn deadly. Historians still argue whether the high mortality rate among servants was primarily due to poor nutrition or the relentless physical demands of their labor. What's clear is that their lives were arduous and often tragically short. You'd see comrades fall ill, weaken, and perhaps disappear. Another life consumed by the castle's ceaseless demands. Despite the hardships, there was a unique camaraderie among the castle staff. They shared their burdens, their small joys, and their frustrations. They formed a tight-knit community, bound by shared experience and mutual dependence. Gossip, stories, and the occasional illicit game of dice would provide brief moments of respite from the endless toil. You'd learn to rely on your fellow servants, to anticipate their needs, and to work together seamlessly to keep the massive household functioning. It was a different kind of family, forged in the crucible of shared labor. And then there was the ever-present threat of the Lord's temper. While some lords were benevolent, others were cruel and capricious. A mistake, a perceived insult, or simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time could result in severe punishment, from a beating to dismissal, which for a servant meant destitution and starvation. You'd learn to be invisible when necessary, to anticipate moods, and to carry out your duties with quiet efficiency, always aware of the precariousness of your position. It's like working for the world's most demanding boss, who also holds the power of life and death over you. So, the next time you marvel at the grandeur of a medieval castle, remember the countless, often nameless individuals who cleaned its floors, cooked its meals, tended its fires, and emptied its privies. Their toil, their resilience, and their often forgotten lives were the true engine that powered these magnificent fortresses, allowing the lords and ladies above to live their lives of power and intrigue. Without them, the castle would have been nothing more than a cold, empty shell. You've acknowledged the unseen labor that kept medieval castles running. But even the most diligent servants couldn't combat every threat. As you linger within the castle walls, you begin to notice something else, something insidious and relentless. The constant, unseen battle against pests and the ever-looming specter of plagues. Forget the romanticized image of pristine halls. Medieval castles, for all their stone and grandeur, were often teeming with a veritable ecosystem of unwelcome guests, from the smallest insect to the most pervasive rodent. Imagine trying to sleep in your straw mattress, not just with the occasional flea, but with the constant scratching and scuttling sounds coming from the walls and floors. Rats and mice were ubiquitous. They gnawed through food stores, contaminated water, and spread droppings everywhere. You'd hear their incessant squeaking in the dead of night, knowing they were feasting on whatever crumbs had fallen from the table, or worse, making their nests in your very living space. They were more than just a nuisance. They were carriers of disease, particularly the dreaded bubonic plague, which would periodically sweep across Europe, decimating populations, castles included. A quirky tidbit. Some castles employed a specific position known as the rat catcher, whose job it was to try and control the rodent population, often using traps or even trained animals like ferrets. It was a never-ending, often losing, battle, and it wasn't just rodents. Fleas and lice were a constant torment. You'd be perpetually itchy, scratching at unseen bites, feeling the tiny pinpricks of their movement on your skin. These parasites didn't discriminate. They infested everyone from the lowliest servant to the highest lord, a constant, irritating reminder of the era's lack of effective pest control. Imagine the casual scratching that must have been a common sight in the Great Hall, even among the nobility. Keeping clothes clean was a monumental task, and bathing was rare, creating ideal breeding grounds for these minuscule tormentors. Historians still argue whether the lack of personal hygiene or the prevalence of rats was the primary vector for the rapid spread of diseases like the Black Death within castle communities. What's undeniable is that both played a significant, terrifying role. Beyond the creepy crawlers, flies and other insects were a pervasive presence, especially in warmer months. Without screens or effective repellents, they swarmed around food, livestock, and waste, further contributing to the spread of disease. You'd constantly be swatting at them, trying to keep them off your plate, a frustrating and unhygienic reality of daily life. The air in some parts of the castle would buzz with their incessant droning, a constant background noise to the sounds of human activity. The conditions within the castle itself often exacerbated the problem. Poor sanitation, as you'll recall, meant that waste accumulated, providing ample breeding grounds for insects and attracting rodents. Food storage was basic, often in unsealed barrels or sacks, making it easy for pests to access and contaminate. Animal enclosures, such as stables and pigsties, were often located within or very close to the castle walls, adding to the general filth and attracting even more vermin. You can almost smell the combined aroma of stale straw, animal waste, and rodent droppings, a pungent overlay to the sense of cooking and wood smoke. When a major plague struck, the castle, far from being a safe haven, could become a death trap. Its very walls, designed to keep enemies out, effectively trapped the inhabitants inside with the disease. The close quarters, the limited medical knowledge, and the constant exposure to vectors like fleas meant that once a contagion took hold, it could sweep through the population with terrifying speed and lethality. You'd witness your friends, family, and fellow servants fall ill, one after another, succumbing to a mysterious, agonizing illness against which there was no defense. The castle, once a symbol of security, would transform into a grim, silent monument to death, its halls echoing with the cries of the sick and the mournful silence of the dead. There was no escaping the reality of these microscopic and macroscopic invaders. They were an inherent part of medieval life, a constant reminder of humanity's vulnerability to the natural world. Lords and ladies, for all their power and wealth, could not command the rats to vanish or the fleas to cease their biting. It was a humbling, yet terrifying, aspect of living in a medieval castle, a never-ending, often losing battle against the forces of nature that constantly threatened to undermine the very fabric of daily existence. So, the next time you admire a pristine medieval castle in a book or on a screen, remember the unseen armies of pests, the constant battle for hygiene, and the terrifying shadow of plague that perpetually lurked within its stone walls. A silent, unsung challenge to daily survival. You've explored the visible and invisible inhabitants of a medieval castle, from lords to lice, but now, let's peel back another layer of secrecy, delving into the forgotten nooks and crannies, the hidden passages and secret chambers that the blueprints of these ancient fortresses. While many castles appear to be solid, impenetrable masses of stone, they often contained clandestine spaces designed for escape, concealment, or espionage. adding another layer to their already mysterious nature. Imagine yourself as a resident of the castle, perhaps a noble or a high-ranking servant. You've walked these halls countless times, climbed these stairs. But what if there were doors you never noticed? Panels that swung inward with a subtle push, or seemingly solid walls that concealed a winding passage. These hidden spaces were not for everyday use. They were strategic assets, designed for moments of extreme peril or hushed conspiracy. A quirky tidbit. Some castles had priest holes, tiny, cramped hiding places, often near fireplaces or within thick walls, where Catholic priests could be concealed during times of persecution. Imagine being crammed into such a dark, airless space for hours, listening to your pursuers search just inches away. The reasons for building such secret chambers were varied. During times of siege, a hidden passage could offer a desperate escape route for the Lord and his family, leading out into the surrounding countryside, allowing them to flee to safety while the castle fell. You can almost feel the frantic urgency, the whispered commands, as a desperate family scurries through a narrow, dark tunnel, their only hope of survival. These passages were often designed to be inconspicuous, their entrances cleverly disguised as part of the normal wall or floor, often only known to a select few trusted individuals. Beyond escape, hidden rooms could serve as secure places for storing valuable treasures, important documents, or even as secret meeting points for plotting political intrigue. Imagine a shadowy gathering, illuminated by a single flickering candle, where conspirators whisper their plans, their voices muffled by the thick stone, their presence unknown to anyone outside their clandestine circle. Historians still argue whether the primary motivation for building hidden passages was military defense or the concealment of political secrets and illicit activities. What's clear is that these spaces served a purpose beyond mere domestic living. Sometimes, these hidden areas were less about grand escape and more about surveillance. Peepholes or listening posts were occasionally built into walls, allowing someone in a hidden chamber to discreetly observe or listen to conversations happening in an adjacent room. Perhaps the Great Hall or the Lord's private chambers, you'd be standing there, unknowingly being watched, your every word potentially being recorded by an unseen ear, adding another layer to the pervasive paranoia of castle life. It makes you wonder how many historical secrets were unknowingly spilled in front of a hidden spy. The construction of these secret spaces required incredible skill and discretion. Masons would have to work in utmost secrecy, often at night, ensuring that no one outside a trusted circle knew of their existence. The very existence of these areas was a closely guarded secret, passed down through generations of the ruling family or their most loyal retainers. To reveal such a secret to an enemy could be disastrous, compromising the Lord's safety or exposing vital intelligence as time wore on, and castles fell into disuse or were modified. Many of these hidden passages and rooms became forgotten, walled up, or simply overlooked. They became ghost stories, whispered legends, until perhaps centuries later, a curious explorer or a lucky renovator might stumble upon a concealed doorway, revealing a long-lost secret. You might picture a dusty, cobweb-filled room, frozen in time, perhaps with an ancient chest or a forgotten scroll, hinting at the lives and intrigues that once unfolded within its confines. It's like finding a hidden level in a very old, very dangerous video game. So, the next time you explore the seemingly straightforward layout of a medieval castle, remember that not everything was as it appeared. Beneath the obvious grandeur and defensive strength, there often lay a labyrinth of hidden passages, secret chambers, and forgotten rooms. Silent witnesses to desperate escapes, hushed conspiracies, and the hidden lives of those who walked its ancient halls. These forgotten spaces are a testament to the complex, often dangerous, world that medieval castles truly were, holding secrets within their very stone. You've explored the hidden architecture, the physical secrets etched into the castle's very stone. But now, let's shift our focus to something less tangible, yet equally profound: the unique and often startling sensory world of a medieval castle. Forget the quiet, orderly museum you might visit today. Imagine stepping into a living, breathing fortress, a place where sound, smell, and even silence itself played a crucial role in daily life and survival. You might first be struck by the sheer cacophony. A castle was rarely a quiet place. In the main courtyard, you'd hear the constant clatter of hooves on cobblestones, the creak of cartwheels, the shouts of stable hands, and the distant clang of the blacksmith's hammer. From the kitchens, the rhythmic thud of a pestle in a mortar, the sizzling of meat over an open fire, and the chatter of cooks would drift on the air. In the great hall, during meals, the din would be immense. Hundreds of voices, the clatter of trenchers and tankards, the braying of a jester, and the occasional barking of dogs. You'd be immersed in a constant, low roar of human and animal activity, a stark contrast to the often silent, isolated lives we lead today. But alongside the noise, there were distinct sounds of defense. The groan of the drawbridge raising, a thunderous crash as the portcullis dropped, the sharp rasp of swords being drawn, or the thud of an arrow hitting its target during target practice. These weren't just background noises, they were vital cues, signals of danger or security. You'd learn to distinguish the friendly sounds of daily life from the ominous sounds of an approaching threat. Your ears constantly attuned to the castle's acoustic landscape. Historians still argue whether the defensive acoustic properties of castle design were intentional or merely a beneficial byproduct of their construction. What's clear is that sound played a crucial role in security. Then there are the smells. Oh, the smells. Forget the perfumed air of modern homes. A medieval castle was a symphony of pungent odors, some familiar, many less so. You'd encounter the constant scent of wood smoke from dozens of hearths, mingling with the earthy aroma of damp stone and straw. From the kitchens, the rich, savory smell of roasting meat and simmering stews would waft through the air, often combined with the less appealing odor of stale food and animal offal. And from the garderobes and cesspits, a truly formidable stench of human waste would rise, particularly on warm, still days. You'd also detect the pervasive smell of unwashed bodies, animals, and even the faint, metallic temps of sweat and blood. It wasn't a world of air fresheners, that's for sure. A quirky tidbit: to combat some of the less pleasant odors, people would strew floors with fragrant herbs like rushes, mint, and lavender, but these were often quickly overwhelmed by the underlying miasma. Imagine trying to explain to someone today that their house smells like a combination of a smoky campfire, a farm, and a public restroom. And what about silence? True, absolute silence would have been incredibly rare, and probably terrifying. If the usual sounds of the castle suddenly ceased, it would be an immediate alarm bell, signaling something was terribly wrong. You'd instinctively strain your ears, searching for the missing sounds, your heart pounding with unease. However, there were moments of relative quiet, particularly at night, when most of the castle slept. In those moments, you might hear the distant howl of a wolf from beyond the walls, the hoot of an owl, or the whisper of the wind through the battlements. Sounds that would feel incredibly vast and lonely against the backdrop of the massive, silent stone. The tactile experience of a castle was also profound. You'd feel the cold, rough texture of the stone walls under your hand, the unevenness of cobbled paths beneath your feet, the dampness that seemed to permeate everything in the lower levels, the heavy weight of thick woolen clothes, the smooth chill of metal armor, the softness of straw in a bedall. These sensations would be deeply ingrained in your daily experience. You'd also feel the constant vibrations of the castle, the distant thud of a falling stone, the creak of settling timbers, the tremor of heavy gates closing dots. So, the next time you imagine a medieval castle, try to engage all your senses. Don't just see the stone and the tapestries. Listen to the clamor of its inhabitants. Smell the wood smoke and the less pleasant odors. Feel the damp chill in the air, and imagine the profound impact of both noise and eerie silence. It was a world that truly assaulted the senses, a raw, unfiltered experience that made every day a vivid, visceral encounter with medieval reality. You've been immersed in the sensory world of the medieval castle, but now, let's explore something even deeper. Something that permeated every corner of daily life. From the highest lord to the lowliest peasant, the pervasive influence of superstition, folklore, and the supernatural. In an age before scientific understanding, when life was brutal and unpredictable, people sought explanations and solace in beliefs that often seem bizarre to us today. Imagine living in a world where unseen forces, good and evil, were believed to be constantly at play, influencing every harvest, every illness, and every battle. You might think of the church as the sole spiritual authority, and certainly Christianity was a powerful force. But alongside formal religious doctrine, a rich tapestry of older, more pagan beliefs persisted, especially in rural areas and among the less educated. These beliefs often revolved around nature spirits, mischievous folk, and malevolent entities. You might hear whispers of a boggart haunting the stable, or a malicious pixie leading travelers astray in the nearby woods. These weren't just quaint stories. They were deeply held convictions that shaped behavior and fueled genuine fear. Consider the role of charms and amulets. People would wear small pouches filled with dried herbs, animal teeth, or blessed relics, believing they offered protection against illness, bad luck, or the evil eye. Farmers might hang horseshoes over their doors to ward off witches, and soldiers might carry a saint's bone for protection in battle. You'd probably have your own small trinket, something passed down through your family, a small piece of comfort. In a world full of unknown dangers, a quirky tidbit. Some medieval people believed that wearing a piece of coral could prevent nosebleeds and protect against evil spirits. It probably didn't help with the nosebleeds, but perhaps the placebo effect was strong. The fear of witchcraft was particularly potent. If crops failed, or livestock died, or someone fell ill with a mysterious ailment, it was often attributed to a witch casting a spell. Accusations of witchcraft could lead to ostracism, torture, and even execution. You'd be careful not to offend anyone, especially an old woman living alone, lest you invite their perceived wrath. The line between natural misfortune and malevolent magic was incredibly blurry, and fear often filled in the gaps. Historians still argue whether the widespread belief in witchcraft was a tool of social control by the church or a genuine reflection of deeply held folk beliefs among the populace. What's clear is that it profoundly impacted people's lives and their interactions beyond overt magic. There was a deep reliance on omens and portents. A flight of birds, the shape of clouds, a dream, or an unusual animal behavior could all be interpreted as messages from the divine or the supernatural, foretelling good fortune or impending disaster. You'd listen intently to the pronouncements of local wise women or traveling soothsayers, trying to decipher the subtle signs that might guide your actions. Even lords and kings consulted astrologers or diviners before making important decisions. From starting a journey to launching a military campaign, it was a world constantly looking for hidden meaning in the mundane. The castle itself might be perceived as a living entity, with its own spirits and secrets. Some castles were believed to be haunted by the ghosts of former inhabitants, restless souls trapped within the stone walls. You might hear tales of phantom knights patrolling the battlements, or the mournful cries of a lady locked in a tower. These stories, passed down through generations, added another layer of mystery and trepidation to life within the fortress. Imagine walking down a deserted corridor at night, the flickering torchlight casting dancing shadows, and hearing an unexplainable creak or whisper. Your imagination, fueled by centuries of folklore, would immediately jump to the supernatural. So, for all their solid stone and military might, medieval castles were also permeable to the invisible forces of the spiritual world, at least in the minds of their inhabitants. Superstition was not just a fringe belief. It was woven into the fabric of daily life, influencing decisions, instilling fear, and providing a framework for understanding a world that often seemed chaotic and incomprehensible. You lived in a world where the veil between the natural and the supernatural was thin, where every shadow might hide a spirit, and every unexplained event could be a sign from beyond. You've navigated the whispers of superstition and the unseen world within the castle. But now, let's confront a stark reality that permeated medieval life and was particularly poignant within the confines of a castle: death and burial. In an era of rampant disease, warfare, and limited medical knowledge, death was not a distant abstraction. It was a frequent, intimate visitor, impacting everyone from the highest lord to the lowliest kitchen hand. Imagine a world where the cycle of life and death was far more rapid and visible than today. You might think of death as a private affair, but in a castle, especially for those of status, it often became a public event, imbued with ritual and ceremony. When a lord or lady died, the news would spread quickly, and the castle would plunge into a period of mourning. The body would be washed, dressed in finery, and often laid in state in the great hall or a private chapel, allowing family, retainers, and even some common folk to pay their respects. You'd witness the grieving family, the somber faces of the household, and the quiet procession as the deceased began their final journey. It was a visible reminder of the impermanence of even the greatest power. The cause of death was often mysterious, attributed to God's will, bad humors, or even witchcraft, as you remember. Without autopsies or modern diagnostics, a sudden fever, a persistent cough, or a lingering illness would simply be accepted as the end. Child mortality rates were tragically high, and it was not uncommon for a family to lose several children before any reached adulthood. You'd see infants and toddlers succumb to simple infections, their small lives extinguished before they truly began, leaving behind a grief that, while profound, was also a common experience. Historians still argue whether the high frequency of death in medieval castles contributed to a more fatalistic worldview, or simply a greater resilience in the face of loss. What's clear is that everyone was intimately familiar with its shadow. When it came to burial, the practices varied based on status and wealth. Nobles and important figures might be interred within the castle chapel, their tombs becoming a permanent part of the fortress, or transported to a nearby monastery or cathedral for a more elaborate burial. Their effigies, carved in stone, would lie in solemn repose, a lasting testament to their lineage and power. You might walk past these tombs daily, a silent procession of past lives, eternally resting within the castle walls. Their presence, a constant reminder of the succession of power. For the vast majority of castle inhabitants, the servants, soldiers, and laborers' burial was much simpler and less distinguished. They would likely be interred in a common burial ground outside the castle walls, perhaps near the local parish church. Their graves would be unmarked, or marked with a simple wooden cross, quickly lost to time and weather. Their deaths, while mourned by their immediate families, would largely go unrecorded in the grand annals of the castle. You might participate in a quiet, solemn procession of a fellow servant, carrying their body wrapped in a simple shroud, knowing that their final resting place would be humble and quickly forgotten. The immediate aftermath of a death within the castle also presented practical challenges. Without modern embalming, bodies decomposed quickly, especially in warmer weather. Funerals needed to happen swiftly, often within a day or two of death. The air might carry the faint, sweet, sickly scent of decay, a grim reminder of the body's ephemeral nature. It was a practical, rather than purely sentimental, necessity to deal with the deceased quickly and reverently, but without delay. Even within the castle, the concept of death permeated daily life. Skulls and bones, perhaps from an ancient crypt or a battle long past, might be displayed in macabre fashion in certain areas, serving as memento mori, reminders of mortality. The constant threat of violence from sieges or internal disputes meant that death could arrive unexpectedly and brutally, not just from disease. You'd be familiar with the sight of injured men, the gruesome reality of wounds, and the swift, often unceremonious removal of bodies from the battlefield or the training yard. So, the next time you gaze upon the enduring stone of a medieval castle, remember that it was not just a fortress, a home, or a symbol of power. It was also a place where life was fragile, where death was a constant presence, and where the rituals of mourning and remembrance were woven deeply into the fabric of daily existence. It stands as a testament to lives lived and lives ended within its ancient, unyielding embrace. You've borne witness to the intimate dance of life and death within the medieval castle. But now, let's fast forward through the centuries. The age of knights and lords eventually faded, and with it, the necessity of these colossal stone fortresses. Imagine the slow, creeping silence that would descend upon a once bustling castle as its purpose waned, as its inhabitants gradually departed, leaving it to the mercy of time and the elements. This is the story of abandonment and ruin, a quieter, yet equally poignant chapter in the life of a castle. You might think of a castle being dramatically destroyed in a final, fiery siege, and some certainly met that end. But many more simply fell into disuse. The invention of gunpowder and increasingly powerful cannons rendered thick stone walls less effective, making older castles vulnerable. Shifting political landscapes meant that central authority grew, and the need for independent strongholds diminished. A lord might inherit lands far from his ancestral castle, preferring to live elsewhere, leaving the old fortress to slowly decay. You'd see the windows, once filled with glass or oiled parchment, become gaping, empty eyesores. The roofs, once meticulously maintained, would begin to leak, allowing rain to seep into the very bones of the structure. The process of ruination was often gradual. First, the more valuable contents would be removed. Tapestries, furniture, tools, anything that could be repurposed or sold. Then, the inhabitants would leave, perhaps a handful of caretakers staying on for a while, but eventually, even they would depart. The sounds of human life would slowly fade, replaced by the whisper of the wind through empty corridors and the cry of birds nesting in the decaying towers. You'd notice the grass growing taller in the courtyards, the once gardens becoming overgrown tangles of weeds. The elements became the new besiegers. Rain, freezing and thawing within cracks in the mortar, would slowly pry stones apart. Winds would howl through the breaches, eroding surfaces. Frost would expand and contract, weakening foundations. Without constant maintenance, a castle, for all its might, was surprisingly vulnerable to the relentless forces of nature. A quirky tidbit: sometimes local peasants would quarry the abandoned castle for their own building materials, taking stones for their homes or walls, effectively dismantling the very structure that once commanded their lives. It was a utilitarian, if rather unsentimental, end for many a grand fortress as the years turned into decades, and decades into centuries. The castle would transform from a living structure into a skeletal ruin. Floors would collapse, ceilings would cave in, and entire sections of walls would crumble. What was once a symbol of immense power and security would become a picturesque yet melancholy monument to a bygone era. You might find a discarded piece of pottery, a rusted buckle, or a child's toy, small echoes of the lives that once bustled within these now silent walls, a poignant reminder of the passage of time. The stories and legends, too, would begin to shift. The vibrant history of the castle would morph into folklore, becoming detached from the actual events. Ghosts would be said to roam the ruins, tales of hidden treasure would abound, and the true purpose of certain chambers would be lost to the mists of time, replaced by more fantastical explanations. Historians still argue whether the romanticization of castle ruins began as a consequence of their abandonment, or was a later invention of antiquarians and poets. What's clear is that their physical decay often fueled a more imaginative, less accurate interpretation of their past. Walking through the ruins today, you can almost hear the ghosts of the past. The echoes of a blacksmith's hammer from a crumbling forge, the faint strains of a lute from a roofless hall, the distant shouts of soldiers from a vanished battlement. The air, though now often filled with the fresh scent of wildflowers and damp earth, still holds a faint, indefinable aura of lives lived and forgotten. It's a powerful experience, walking through these skeletal remains, feeling the cold touch of history, knowing that beneath your feet lie centuries of untold stories and silent memories. So the next time you visit a castle ruin, don't just see the broken stones and the crumbling walls. See the slow, inexorable march of time, the gradual surrender to nature, and the quiet fading of human purpose. It's a powerful testament to impermanence, a reminder that even the mightiest structures, built to last forever, eventually return to the earth from which they came, leaving behind only echoes and a profound sense of vanished glory. You've journeyed through the harsh realities of medieval castle life and witnessed their slow descent into ruin. But now, as we draw our journey to a close, let's reflect on the enduring mysteries and misconceptions that still cling to these magnificent, crumbling structures. despite centuries of study, excavations, and popular culture portrayals. Medieval castles continue to hold secrets, leaving us to ponder what truly happened within their formidable walls, and how much of what we think we know is actually true. Imagine how much knowledge has been lost to time. Records were sparse, often incomplete, and sometimes intentionally misleading. Much of what we know comes from archaeological digs, which can only tell us so much, and from chroniclers who often had their own biases and agendas. You might read a detailed account of a siege, but miss the everyday struggles of the kitchen staff or the secret whispers exchanged between enemies in the dark. The mundane, the private, the truly dark secrets were rarely committed to parchment, leaving vast gaps in our understanding. Historians still argue whether the written accounts of medieval life accurately reflect the experiences of the common people or are simply the biased narratives of the elite. What's clear is that we're always piecing together a puzzle with many missing pieces. Consider the pervasive myths. Hollywood, novels, and popular imagination have often painted a romanticized, sometimes exaggerated, picture of castle life. Knights were not always chivalrous heroes. They were often brutal warriors concerned with land and power. Ladies were not always damsels in distress. Many were shrewd managers of estates, wielding significant influence. Dungeons were rarely the elaborate torture chambers of our nightmares, but rather places of grim, mundane suffering. You've now seen how the truth, while less sensational than fiction, is often far more compelling and human. It's like discovering that your favorite superhero actually spent most of their time doing paperwork. Then there are the genuine mysteries that continue to puzzle historians and archaeologists. Why was a certain passage sealed off? What was the true purpose of a strange, isolated tower? What happened to the treasure supposedly hidden before a castle fell? Unexplained skeletal remains, strange artifacts, or anomalous architectural features occasionally turn up, opening new avenues of inquiry and challenging long-held assumptions. You might find yourself staring at a particular section of a ruin, wondering what stories those silent stones could tell if they could only speak. A quirky tidbit: some castles have ghost stories that are so deeply ingrained in local folklore that they become part of the castle's unofficial history, even if there's no historical evidence to back them up. These tales, however, reflect the emotional imprint the castles left on the generations who lived and died around them. The very scale of castle construction remains awe-inspiring. How did they manage to lift such immense stones, often without modern equipment? How did they coordinate thousands of laborers over decades? While we have some understanding of their engineering prowess, the sheer logistical undertaking remains a marvel. You can't help but feel a sense of profound respect for the ingenuity and sheer human will that went into creating these structures, even as you acknowledge the suffering upon which they were built. And finally, the legacy. Despite their abandonment and ruin, medieval castles continue to capture our imaginations. They stand as enduring symbols of power, history, and a lost world. They draw millions of visitors each year, eager to touch the ancient stones, to walk where kings and queens once walked, and to glimpse a past that feels both alien and strangely familiar. They remind us of our own mortality, the rise and fall of empires, and the relentless march of time. You stand before 1,000 years of history, contemplating the countless lives that unfolded within these walls, the joy, the sorrow, the intrigue, the brutal reality, as the sun sets on our journey tonight, casting long, peaceful shadows over the ancient stones. Remember that the dark secrets of medieval castles aren't just about gore and gloom. They are about the raw, unfiltered truth of human existence in a challenging age. The ingenuity, the resilience, the desperate struggles, and the profound superstitions that shaped the lives of those who called these formidable fortresses home. These castles, even in their ruin, whispered tales of a world that was far more complex, dangerous, and utterly fascinating than any fairy tale. Now, as the stories of medieval castles begin to fade into the soft hum of your room, let your mind drift away from the stone and shadow, the clamor and the quiet. Allow the images of long-forgotten lives, of brave knights and cunning lords, of hard-working servants and mischievous spirits to gently recede. The sounds of distant hooves and whispering secrets are softening, becoming mere echoes in the deep, peaceful night. You've journeyed far, through centuries of history, and now it's time to let those heavy, ancient tales settle, like dust motes in a shaft of moonlight. Feel the comforting weight of your blanket, the steady rhythm of your breath, and the growing sense of calm. The castle, in all its truth and mystery, is now simply a memory, a story told, a distant echo in the quiet stillness. Let any lingering thoughts dissipate, like smoke from an ancient hearth, leaving only peace. Rest deeply, knowing that the past, for all its darkness, has now receded, leaving you safe in the present moment.